Ed and Lorraine Warren, 50 years of demon hunting that the church documented and Hollywood immortalized. In the heart of Connecticut, among the mists of New England and the ancestral forests that have witnessed the birth of dark legends for centuries, there exists a name that has divided the world between believers and skeptics, between those who seek answers in the supernatural and those who deny everything that cannot be explained by reason. Ed and Lorraine Warren. Two names that, spoken together, evoke images of haunted houses, possessed dolls, terrified families, and phenomena that defy all logic. But before becoming the most famous and controversial paranormal investigators of the 20th century, before Hollywood turned their cases into films that terrified millions of people worldwide, before their occult museum filled with the most disturbing objects ever documented, Ed and Lorraine Warren were simply two young people in love who shared an extraordinary gift and an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. The story begins in 1926 on September 7th, when Edward Warren Miney was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His father, a police officer with a tough and pragmatic character, never imagined that his son would dedicate his life to chasing ghosts and demons. Ed's childhood unfolded in a modest two-story house on a quiet street in Bridgeport, where neighbors knew each other and doors were rarely locked. But that house, according to records that Ed himself would share decades later in documented and archived interviews at universities and public libraries, hid a secret that would forever mark the young man's destiny. When Ed was barely 5 years old, the phenomena began. At first they were small things that his family attributed to a child's overactive imagination. Noises in the walls, shadows moving in the corners of rooms, the constant sensation of being watched. But one night, according to testimony that Ed would consistently repeat for over 50 years in recorded and publicly archived interviews, something changed. It was past midnight when the boy woke up with a dry throat. Opening his eyes in the darkness of his room, he saw a figure next to his closet. It wasn't an imprecise shadow or a play of nocturnal lights. It was the clear and defined form of an old man staring at him fixedly, a figure that glowed with a dim and sickly light. The child screamed, his parents came running, but when they turned on the light, there was no one. This incident, documented in the book, The Demonologist, written by Gerald Brittle in 1980, and verified in multiple interviews archived at the University of Connecticut, was the first of many. 4 years, Ed experienced apparitions, whispered voices in empty rooms, and what he described as an oppressive presence that seemed to follow him. His father, a man of law and order, rejected these stories as childhood fantasies. But Ed knew what he had seen. And those experiences, far from terrifying him into silence, awakened in him a fascination that would last his entire life. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, on January 31st, 1927, Lorraine Rita Moran was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. From a very early age, according to archived interview records and publicly documented testimonies from family members, Lorraine showed abilities that her devout Catholic family considered a divine gift. She saw lights around people, colored lights that she would later identify as auras. She felt others' emotions as if they were her own, experienced vivid premonitions that came true with disturbing precision. Her mother, deeply religious, taught her to pray for protection and to see her gift not as a curse but as a spiritual responsibility. Lorraine grew up in a home where Catholic faith was not simply a Sunday practice but the very foundation of existence. Rosaries, nightly prayers, images of saints in every room, all this formed the spiritual shield that Lorraine would use decades later in her most dangerous investigations. But being different, seeing things others couldn't see, feeling invisible presences, made her childhood a lonely and sometimes frightening experience. At school, according to her own words documented in interviews archived at the New England Society for Psychic Research, Lorraine quickly learned to hide her abilities. Children who talked to invisible entities were considered strange, disturbed, different in a dangerous way. Destiny, or perhaps something greater than simple chance, had plans for these two young people. In 1944, when Ed was 18 years old and Lorraine 17, their paths crossed. Ed, who had left high school to work and help his family during the difficult years of World War II, was employed as an usher at the Colonial Theater in Bridgeport. Lorraine, a shy but strikingly beautiful teenager, attended the cinema regularly. It was in that dark theater, between black and white films and the smell of popcorn, where their eyes met for the first time. Ed was immediately captivated, not only by Lorraine's physical beauty, but by something he perceived in her, an indefinable quality that resonated with his own experiences of the inexplicable. Lorraine, for her part, saw in Ed someone who could understand what she saw. In the following weeks, Ed found excuses to talk to her every time she visited the theater. Initial conversations about movies and weather soon drifted toward deeper and stranger territories. Ed told her about his childhood experiences with apparitions. Lorraine, with a mixture of relief and amazement, confessed her own abilities. For the first time in their lives, both found someone who didn't judge them, who didn't consider them crazy or different in a negative way. The love between Ed and Lorraine blossomed quickly, with the intensity typical of two souls who had finally found their reflection in the world. In 1945, barely a year after meeting, and with Ed 19 years old and Lorraine 18, the couple married. It was a simple but deeply emotional ceremony, celebrated in a Catholic church in Bridgeport, with both families present and the blessing of a priest who never imagined where that marriage would lead the young couple. The marriage records, archived in the Bridgeport City Hall and publicly accessible, document the union that would last almost 70 years, one of the most enduring and controversial partnerships in the history of paranormal investigation. The first years of marriage were, in appearance, completely normal. Ed, who had served briefly in the United States Navy during World War II according to military records archived in the Department of Veterans Affairs, returned to civilian life with artistic ambitions. He had discovered a natural talent for painting, specifically for capturing on canvas the historic and haunted houses of New England. With a box of paints, portable easels, and an old automobile that constantly threatened to break down, Ed began traveling through Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, painting old houses that he would then sell door to door to the property owners themselves. Lorraine accompanied him on those trips. While Ed set up his easel and mixed his colors, she explored the surroundings, talked to neighbors, listened to local stories. And it was during these casual conversations, on worn wooden porches and kitchens that smelled of freshly brewed coffee, when the tales began to emerge. Stories of unexplained noises in the attic, sightings of spectral figures on the stairs, objects that moved by themselves, children who talked to invisible friends. New England, with its centuries of history, its colonial cemeteries and its legends of witches and hangings, was fertile territory for the supernatural. At first, Ed and Lorraine simply listened to these stories with polite interest, occasionally sharing their own experiences when they felt they could trust their interlocutors. But in 1952, according to documentation archived in interviews and authorized biographies, an event occurred that transformed their passive curiosity into active investigation. A family in Stratford, Connecticut, contacted Ed after seeing one of his paintings in a neighbor's house. They didn't want to buy a painting. They wanted help. Their house, a two-story colonial construction over 200 years old, was experiencing phenomena that had escalated from annoying to terrifying. Ed and Lorraine visited the property one autumn afternoon. The owners, a middle-aged couple with 3 small children, described with tense voices and exhausted eyes the events that had transformed their home into a nightmare. Heavy footsteps on the upper floor when the entire family was downstairs. Doors that slammed violently without air currents. The temperature that dropped suddenly in specific rooms. And most disturbing, their children had begun talking about an old man who appeared in their rooms at night, a man who frightened them but insisted on staying. Lorraine, as soon as she crossed the threshold of that house, felt something that she would later describe in archived testimonies as a physical oppression, as if the air itself were denser and more hostile. As she walked through the rooms, she experienced what she called visions, fragmentary images of past events, residual emotions impregnated in the walls and floors. She saw an old man, exactly as the children had described him, standing next to a second-floor window, looking outward with an expression of deep sadness. When they investigated the property's historical records at the Fairfield County Archives, publicly accessible documents, they discovered that a man had died in that house decades earlier, an old man who had lived alone his final years. This case, although relatively minor compared to what would come later, was fundamental. Ed began researching paranormal investigation techniques, reading everything he could find on the subject in public libraries and contacting the few people who at that time were dedicated to the study of the supernatural. Lorraine, for her part, began to understand and develop her abilities as a clairvoyant medium. She discovered that she could intentionally tune into the presences that inhabited these places, communicate with them, understand their motivations. It was a dangerous gift that required constant spiritual protection, and Lorraine never conducted an investigation without praying first, without carrying her rosary, without invoking the divine protection that her Catholic faith provided. In 1954, Judy Warren was born, Ed and Lorraine's only daughter. The birth records, archived at St. Vincent Hospital in Bridgeport, document the birth of Judy Spera, who grew up in a unique and extraordinary environment. From her earliest childhood, Judy was surrounded by the paranormal. Her home was not simply a family house but also her parents' base of operations, a place where desperate people constantly arrived seeking help, where demonic possessions were discussed during dinner, where supposedly cursed objects accumulated in a special room that her parents kept under strict protection and religious blessing. Lorraine, aware of the dangers that her work implied, was extremely protective of Judy. According to testimonies from Judy Sparrow herself in documented and publicly archived interviews, she was never allowed to enter the room where her parents kept the most dangerous objects from their investigations. That room, which would later become the famous Warren Occult Museum, was forbidden territory. Ed installed special locks, kept the room regularly blessed by priests, and constantly warned his daughter that some objects possessed energies too dangerous to be treated lightly. As Judy grew, Ed and Lorraine tried to give her as normal a childhood as possible within the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. Judy attended the local Catholic school, played with neighborhood friends, participated in typical children's activities. But inevitably, the nature of her parents' work affected her. Other children and their families began to avoid her when word spread about what the Warrens did. Some looked at her with morbid curiosity, others with superstitious fear. Judy learned from a very young age to keep family life private, not to talk too much about what her parents did for a living. During these formative years, Ed supplemented his painting income with occasional jobs while gradually establishing his reputation as a paranormal investigator. Lorraine dedicated herself mainly to Judy and developing her psychic abilities. The couple began to be contacted more frequently by families experiencing inexplicable phenomena. Each case was different. Some houses simply had residual presences, echoes of the past without intelligence or malice. Others faced poltergeists, entities that could manipulate physical objects. And in some cases, the darkest and most dangerous, Ed and Lorraine suspected something much worse. Demonic presences that were not human spirits but something completely different, entities of pure malevolence that sought to terrorize, possess and destroy. It was also during these years when Ed and Lorraine began their relationship with the Catholic Church. They contacted local priests, explained their work, requested theological guidance. Some clergy rejected them with skepticism or disapproval. But others, particularly those who had had their own experiences with the inexplicable, welcomed them and provided spiritual support. Ed and Lorraine always insisted that they were not exorcists, that only ordained priests could perform official exorcisms according to Catholic rite. But they became consultants, investigators who determined whether a case required ecclesiastical intervention, and their reputation within certain church circles began to grow. In 1952, Ed officially founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, according to incorporation documents archived in Connecticut state records. It was a modest organization, operating mainly from their home, but it represented their serious commitment to what they now considered not just a fascination but a vocation. Lorraine became the associate director. Together they began giving lectures at local churches, schools and community centers, sharing their experiences and offering help to those who needed it. The lectures were free or with voluntary donations. The Warrens consistently insisted that they did not charge for their investigations, only accepting help with travel expenses when distances were significant. The 1960s marked a turning point in Ed and Lorraine Warren's career. What had begun as local investigations in Connecticut gradually expanded throughout the northeastern United States. Their reputation grew through word of mouth, desperate families who had heard from others that the Warrens might help. But it was in 1968 when they faced a case that would catapult them to national public attention and establish their investigation methodology for decades to come. The case of the Peron family in Harrisville, Rhode Island, although it would not become completely public until years later, began precisely that year when the family moved to a 200-year-old colonial farmhouse. The Perrons, Roger and Carolyn, along with their 5 daughters, purchased the property in January of 1971, according to property records archived in Burrillville County, Rhode Island. The house, an imposing white wooden construction with 14 rooms, seemed like the perfect place to raise their family. But from the first night, the phenomena began. Carolyn Peron woke up feeling something brushing her leg. When she turned on the light, there was no one, but the sensation persisted, an invisible presence next to her bed. The following days brought more events: doors that opened and closed by themselves, brooms that appeared in the center of rooms, the smell of rotting meat that emerged without apparent source, whispered voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The 5 Peron girls, according to testimonies documented in the book, House of Darkness, House of Light, written by Andrea Peron, the eldest daughter, and published in 2011, began to see apparitions. Some presences seemed benign, spirits that simply coexisted with the family. But there was one entity that particularly terrified everyone, a woman the girls described as grotesque, with her neck clearly broken and hanging at an unnatural angle. This presence, which they would later identify as Bathsheba Sherman, seemed to feel particular hatred toward Carolyn Peron, as if she considered her an intruder in her territory. For months, the family tried to deal with the situation on their own. Roger Peron, skeptical by nature, tried to find rational explanations for each event. Old pipes caused noises. Air currents moved doors. The girls' imagination exaggerated normal shadows. But as the phenomena escalated in frequency and intensity, even Roger had to admit that something inexplicable was occurring in his home. Carolyn began experiencing vivid nightmares where she was physically attacked. She woke up with bruises and marks she couldn't explain. The girls refused to sleep alone. The entire family was on the brink of psychological collapse. It was in 1973 when Carolyn Peron, desperate and exhausted, attended one of Ed and Lorraine Warren's public lectures at the University of Connecticut. The lecture, documented in university records publicly archived, dealt with cases of paranormal infestation and how to recognize the difference between natural and genuinely supernatural phenomena. Carolyn listened with growing attention as Ed described symptoms that matched exactly what her family was experiencing. At the end of the lecture, she timidly approached the couple and told them her story. Ed and Lorraine agreed to investigate the case. In April of 1973, they visited the Peron farm for the first time. Lorraine, as soon as she crossed the threshold, felt immediate oppression. The house was saturated with energies, some residual and passive, but others actively hostile. While Ed installed his primitive recording equipment, cameras and temperature gauges, Lorraine walked through the rooms in a state of meditative concentration, opening her psychic senses to the presences that inhabited the place. What she experienced was overwhelming. Multiple spirits, layers of history, tragedies accumulated over centuries. During the following days, Ed and Lorraine conducted exhaustive investigations. Ed visited the Burrillville Town Hall and reviewed all the property's historical records, publicly accessible documents that revealed a dark history. The land had been owned by several families over more than 2 centuries. Several children had died on the property in various circumstances, from illnesses to accidents. But the most disturbing discovery was the story of Bathsheba Sherman, a woman who had lived in the 19th century and about whom there were rumors, never completely proven but recorded in local newspapers of the time, of witchcraft and child sacrifice. Bathsheba Thayer had been born in 1812 according to archived parish records. She married Judson Sherman and they lived on the property that the Perrons would later purchase. Historical records show that several babies died under suspicious circumstances while under her care. One of these cases went to trial, with Bathsheba accused of sacrificing a baby by driving a needle into the base of its skull. Although she was acquitted for lack of conclusive evidence, according to local newspaper reports archived in the Rhode Island Public Library, neighbors avoided her, whispering that she had made a pact with dark forces. Bathsheba died in 1885, according to her publicly archived death certificate, apparently by suicide hanging from a tree on the property. Lorraine identified Bathsheba's presence as the most dangerous entity in the house. During a particularly intense session, according to Andrea Peron's testimony documented in her autobiographical book, Lorraine was momentarily possessed by the entity. Her voice changed, her face contorted, and she uttered violent threats against Carolyn Peron. Ed had to intervene physically, praying aloud and using holy water to help Lorraine regain control. This incident demonstrated how powerful and malevolent the presence that inhabited the farm was. The Warrens contacted several Catholic priests seeking to perform an exorcism of the property, but they encountered resistance. The Peron family was not Catholic, and the Catholic Church had strict protocols about when and where official exorcisms could be performed. Additionally, Roger Peron, although finally convinced that something supernatural was occurring, feared that a public exorcism could ruin his family's reputation and affect his property's value. The Warrens did what they could: blessings, prayers, instructions on how to protect themselves spiritually. But without a formal exorcism, Bathsheba's presence would remain. The Peron family lived in that house for 10 years until 1980, when they finally sold the property and moved. According to Andrea Peron, the phenomena never completely ceased during their entire stay. They learned to coexist with the presences, establishing boundaries, claiming specific spaces as their own. But the psychological damage was deep and lasting. Carolyn Peron never fully recovered from the years of constant attacks. The daughters grew up with traumatic memories that would mark them for life. For Ed and Lorraine Warren, The Peron case was an education in what they would repeatedly face in their career. Vulnerable families, houses with dark histories, entities that were not simply ghosts but something much more dangerous. Ed began to theorize, based on consultations with Catholic theologians documented in his archived lectures, about a hierarchy of the supernatural. At the base were natural phenomena misinterpreted. Then residual presences, echoes without consciousness. Then human spirits with consciousness that remain tied to the physical world. And at the top, the most dangerous, demonic entities that had never been human, that pretended to be ghosts to gain access to the living, whose ultimate goal was complete possession. While the Peron case developed privately, remaining relatively confidential until decades later, another case brought the Warrens to national public attention dramatically. In November of 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. brutally murdered 6 members of his family in their home in Amityville, New York. The facts are exhaustively documented in police and judicial records archived in Suffolk County. DeFeo shot his father, mother, and 4 siblings while they slept. During the trial, he claimed that voices in the house had ordered him to commit the murders. He was found guilty and sentenced to 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life in prison. 13 months later, in December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz purchased the Amityville house at 112 Ocean Avenue with a significant discount due to its recent history. Property records, publicly archived in Suffolk County, document the transaction. The Lutzes moved in with their 3 children, hoping to start a new life. But according to their own testimonies, extensively documented in the book, The Amityville Horror, by J. Anson, published in 1977, they began experiencing terrifying phenomena from the first night. George Lutz claimed to wake up regularly at 3:15 in the morning, the approximate time when the murders had occurred. Kathy Lutz reported vivid nightmares about the murders. The family heard inexplicable noises, the house smelled of excrement without apparent source, temperatures dropped without reason in specific rooms. The children talked about an imaginary friend with red eyes. A room in the basement, which they dubbed the Red Room, emanated a sensation of evil so intense that the family avoided approaching it. After only 28 days on the property, the Lutzes fled in January of 1976, abandoning all their belongings and swearing never to return. Ed and Lorraine Warren were contacted by the Lutzes shortly after their flight. They visited the Amityville house, conducted their investigation, and Lorraine claimed to feel an extremely powerful demonic presence. Ed took photographs, some of which, according to the Warrens, captured anomalous images including the famous ghost boy photograph that supposedly shows a child figure on the stairs. This photograph, widely reproduced and debated, remains archived in the Warren Occult Museum and has been analyzed by skeptics and believers for decades. The Warrens publicly declared that the Amityville house was genuinely infested, that the Lutzes had experienced authentic horror. This declaration catapulted the case to national consciousness. The Amityville Horror became a bestseller, selling millions of copies. A film was produced in 1979 that was a massive box office success. Ed and Lorraine Warren participated in countless television interviews, radio programs, public appearances. Their name became synonymous with paranormal investigation in the United States. However, the Amityville case also attracted a level of scrutiny and skepticism that would haunt the Warrens for the rest of their lives. Skeptical investigators, particularly Dr. Stephen Kaplan, founder of the Parapsychology Institute of Long Island, declared that the entire story was an elaborate fraud. Kaplan, whose research is documented in his book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy, published in 1995, argued that the Lutzes had invented the paranormal events to make money, possibly with the help of their attorney William Weber, who had represented Ronald DeFeo and was seeking reasons to appeal his conviction. William Weber, in publicly archived judicial statements, admitted in 1979 that he, George Lutz, and the Warrens had created the Amityville story over several bottles of wine. This admission, although Weber later partially recanted, cast a shadow of doubt over the entire case. Subsequent owners of the house at 112 Ocean Avenue never reported paranormal phenomena, according to interviews documented in archived local newspapers. The family that bought the house after the Lutzes lived there for decades without extraordinary incidents. Ed and Lorraine Warren always defended the authenticity of the Amityville case. In documented and archived interviews, they insisted they had been direct witnesses to genuine phenomena during their brief investigation. They argued that demonic entities were intelligent and capricious, that they could choose to manifest or remain inactive. The fact that later owners experienced nothing did not invalidate the Lutzes' experiences, but the damage to their credibility was done. From Amityville forward, Every case the Warrens investigated would be examined with intense skepticism by a significant portion of the public and the scientific community. Despite the controversy, or perhaps partly because of it, the investigation requests the Warrens received multiplied. Families from throughout the United States and eventually from other countries contacted them, desperate for help against phenomena they couldn't explain or control. Ed and Lorraine developed a routine. Ed handled the technical and historical aspects of each investigation, reviewing records, interviewing witnesses, documenting evidence. Lorraine used her psychic abilities to identify the presences, communicate with them when possible, determine their nature and level of dangerousness. They worked exclusively with cases they considered genuine, rejecting those they suspected were frauds or misunderstandings. Among all the cases that Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated during their extensive career, there are several that stand out not only for the intensity of the reported phenomena but for the level of documentation, cultural impact and controversy they generated. These cases defined the Warren legacy and established the archetypes that Hollywood would later exploit in countless horror films. But before the films existed, before Hollywood producers turned these events into lucrative entertainment, there were real families facing horrors that defied all logic, and two investigators who risked their reputation, their sanity and, according to them, their immortal souls to help them. In 1970, long before it became a cinematic sensation, the Warrens became involved in a case that would remain relatively obscure for decades: the Annabelle doll case. Donna, a nursing student living in an apartment near Hartford, Connecticut, received as a gift from her mother a Raggedy and Rag doll. Records and testimonies, documented in the book, The Demonologist by Gerald Brittle and in multiple archived interviews with the Warrens, established that what began as an innocent gift quickly transformed into a nightmare. The doll began moving on its own. Donna would leave it in a specific position before going to work and return to find it in a completely different room, in poses she had not created. Notes appeared written in childish handwriting on ancient parchment paper, a type of paper that Donna and her roommate Angie swore they did not have in the apartment. The messages were simple but disturbing: "Help us," or "Help Lou." Lou was Angie's boyfriend, who from the beginning had insisted there was something malevolent about the doll. The situation escalated dramatically one night when Lou, sleeping in the apartment, woke up feeling a presence in the room. According to his documented testimony, he felt something climbing up his legs, paralyzing him. When he could finally move and turn on the light, he saw the Annabelle doll on the floor next to his bed. Days later, Lou and Angie heard noises coming from Donna's room. Thinking it might be an intruder, Lou entered carefully. The room was empty except for the doll, which was standing in a corner, something physically impossible given its rag construction. When Lou approached, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. When he lifted his shirt, he discovered 7 parallel cuts as if made by claws, bleeding on his torso. Terrified, the young women consulted with a local medium who, after a session, informed them that the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a girl named Annabelle Higgins, who had died on the property years ago and simply sought to be loved. Moved, Donna and Angie gave permission for the spirit to stay. But this, as the Warrens would later explain, was a critical mistake. By giving permission, they had invited the entity, and the situation worsened dramatically. It was then that they contacted a priest, who in turn contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens investigated the case and reached a disturbing conclusion. According to their analysis, documented in multiple archived interviews, there was no spirit of a girl named Annabelle Higgins. In fact, there was no record that a girl with that name had died on the property according to Hartford County records that Ed investigated exhaustively. What inhabited the doll, the Warrens argued, was a demonic entity that had pretended to be a harmless child spirit to gain access to the apartment and eventually attempt to possess one of the residents. The doll was simply a conduit, an object the entity had chosen to manifest itself. Ed and Lorraine, with the blessing of a Catholic priest, Father Cook according to records from the Archdiocese of Hartford, performed a blessing of the apartment and took the Annabelle doll. The return trip to their home in Monroe, Connecticut, was notably dangerous. Ed, who was driving with the doll in the back seat inside a bag, experienced multiple inexplicable mechanical failures. The brakes stopped working on several occasions. The engine would shut off without reason. Finally, Ed sprayed the doll with holy water and the rest of the trip proceeded without incidents. Annabelle was placed in the Warren Occult Museum, a special room in their house where they kept objects from their investigations that they considered dangerous. The doll was put in a wooden box with glass, regularly blessed by priests and accompanied by a warning sign. According to the Warrens, in documented and archived interviews over decades, the doll continued to be dangerous. Museum visitors who touched the box or mocked the warning supposedly experienced accidents shortly after. A young motorcyclist who, according to the Warrens' testimony never independently verified, hit the glass and challenged the doll, died in a traffic accident hours later. These accounts, impossible to verify completely, contributed to Annabelle's legend. While the Annabelle case remained relatively unknown outside paranormal circles, another case was about to catapult the Warrens to international attention again. In August of 1977 in Enfield, a suburb north of London, England, phenomena began in the house of Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children. This case, known as the Enfield poltergeist, would become one of the most documented and debated in the history of paranormal investigation, with photographic evidence, audio recordings and testimonies from multiple witnesses including police and journalists. The phenomena began with knocking on the walls. Peggy's daughters, Janet aged 11 and Margaret aged 13, heard the knocking coming from the other side of their shared bedroom. When they called their mother, Peggy also heard them. The knocking moved as if someone were walking inside the walls. Then furniture began to move. Beds shook violently. Chairs overturned. Children were literally thrown from their beds by invisible forces. Terrified, the family called the police. Officer Carolyn Heaps responded to the call, and her testimony, officially archived in the records of the Metropolitan Police Department of London, confirmed that she witnessed inexplicable phenomena. She saw with her own eyes a chair move across the floor without anyone touching it. Her testimony, given under oath and publicly documented, gave the case a credibility that many other paranormal cases lacked. When the phenomena escalated, the Society for Psychic Research of London assigned Maurice Grosse and later Guy Lyon Playfair to investigate. Grosse and Playfair documented the case exhaustively for over 2 years. They took more than 1,200 photographs, many of which are archived in the Society for Psychic Research and publicly available. They recorded hours of audio, including paranormal voices that supposedly came from Janet, deep and masculine voices that claimed to be spirits of people who had died in the house. One of these voices, which identified itself as Bill Wilkins, a man who had lived and died on the property, was analyzed by linguistics experts. The analyses, documented in archived technical reports, showed that Janet's vocal cords could not naturally produce such a deep and profound voice. Ed and Lorraine Warren visited Enfield on several occasions during the course of the infestation, invited by Grosse. Their participation was brief compared to that of the British investigators, but Lorraine identified what she considered the signature of a demonic presence. According to her statements documented in interviews, the entity was pretending to be Bill Wilkins to gain trust and access, but its real objective was to possess Janet. Ed took the famous photograph of Janet apparently levitating above her bed, an image that became iconic of the case. Skeptics argue that the photograph simply captures Janet jumping from the bed, but believers point to the frequency with which multiple witnesses reported seeing her levitate without visible means of propulsion. The Enfield case divided the paranormal community. Some investigators considered it definitive evidence of genuine poltergeist phenomena. Others, including members of the Society for Psychic Research itself, suspected that at least some of the phenomena were fraudulent, perpetrated by the Hodgson girls seeking attention. Grosse and Playfair admitted they had caught the girls faking some events, particularly in later stages of the infestation, but insisted that the majority of phenomena were genuine and defied rational explanation. Their complete investigation was published in the book, This House is Haunted by Guy Lyon Playfair in 1980, meticulously documenting the case. The phenomena in Enfield finally ceased in 1979, approximately 2 years after beginning. The Hodgson family remained in the house, and although they occasionally reported minor events, the intensity of the infestation never returned. Janet Hodgson, now an adult, has given documented interviews where she maintains that most of what she experienced was genuine, although she admits that in moments of desperation for attention, she and her sister faked some minor events. Her consistent testimony over decades gives the case particular credibility. For Ed and Lorraine Warren, Enfield was important not only for the validation of having their work documented internationally but because it reinforced their theories about the progressive nature of demonic infestations. According to the model that Ed developed and presented in lectures documented at universities and archived in public libraries, a typical demonic infestation follows 3 stages. First, infestation, where the entity establishes presence through physical phenomena, noises, object movements. Second, oppression, where the entity begins to attack victims psychologically and physically, causing nightmares, depression, illness. Third, possession, where the entity takes complete control of a victim's body. The Warrens argued they had intervened in Enfield during the oppression phase, before a complete possession could occur. While the Annabelle and Enfield cases established the Warrens as international figures in paranormal investigation, their most dangerous and controversial work involved exorcisms. Although they were not priests and therefore could not perform official exorcisms according to Catholic rite, the Warrens frequently assisted at exorcisms as consultants, helping priests identify whether a person was genuinely possessed or simply suffering from mental illness. This distinction was crucial and extremely difficult to determine. One of the most documented possession cases in which the Warrens participated was that of Arne Cheyenne Johnson in 1981. This case, which occurred in Brookfield, Connecticut, culminated in murder and became the first trial in United States legal history where the defense attempted to use demonic possession as an argument. The facts are exhaustively documented in judicial records archived in the Connecticut Superior Court, as well as in the book, The Devil in Connecticut, by Gerald Brittle, published in 1983. It all began in July of 1980 when David Glatzel, an 11-year-old boy, began experiencing terrifying visions in the house his family was renovating in Brookfield. David described seeing an old man with dark eyes, burned skin and ancient clothing who threatened him. The phenomena escalated. David was thrown violently, had outbursts where he spoke in voices that were not his own, knew information he had no way of knowing. The Glatzel family, devout Catholics, contacted their priest, who in turn contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens investigated and concluded that David was being attacked by a demonic entity. With the family's permission and supervision of priests, several minor exorcisms were performed on David. During one of these rituals, according to documented testimonies from multiple witnesses present including the Warrens, Arne Johnson, the boyfriend of David's older sister, challenged the entity. "Take me instead of the child," Arne shouted. The Warrens and the priests present warned against this, but according to their accounts, the damage was done. The entity had been invited. In the following months, according to testimonies from his family and girlfriend Debbie Glatzel documented in archived interviews, Arne began behaving strangely. He had episodes where he didn't remember entire hours. He growled and made animal sounds. His eyes turned completely black according to multiple witnesses. The Warrens tried to help him, but Arne rejected religious rituals. On February 16, 1981, during an argument with his landlord Alan Bono about an apartment rental, Arne pulled out a knife and stabbed him repeatedly. Bono died from his wounds. Arne was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Defense attorney Martin Minella, in an unprecedented move documented in publicly archived judicial transcripts, attempted to argue that Arne was not guilty by reason of demonic possession. The Warrens would testify if allowed. Several priests who had participated in David Glatzel's exorcisms were willing to testify. The case attracted massive national and international media attention. But Judge Robert Callahan rejected the demonic possession defense, declaring that there was no way to scientifically prove or refute such a claim and that therefore it was not admissible in a court of justice. Unable to use his primary defense, Minella argued involuntary manslaughter instead of first degree, suggesting that Arne had acted under extreme emotional provocation. Arne Cheyenne Johnson was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He served 5 years before being released for good behavior in 1986. After his release, Arne married Debbie Glatzel and, according to subsequent documented interviews, they maintained that the possession had been real and that Arne was not responsible for his actions during the murder. The Johnson case was controversial even within the Glatzel family. Carl Glatzel Jr., David's brother, later sued the Warrens and author Gerald Brittle, alleging they had fabricated the demonic possession story and that David simply suffered from mental illness that had been exacerbated by the supposed exorcisms. The lawsuit, filed in 1987 according to public judicial records from the Connecticut court, sought damages for defamation and emotional distress. The case was eventually dismissed, but left more questions about the Warrens' ethics and methodology. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Ed and Lorraine continued investigating cases, giving lectures, writing books. Ed published several volumes documenting their most significant cases, always collaborating with professional writers. Lorraine continued developing her psychic abilities and established a reputation as one of the most respected clairvoyant mediums in certain circles, though perpetually questioned in others. They trained other investigators, established a network of consultants that included priests, psychologists, doctors and other professionals willing to consider supernatural explanations when natural ones seemed insufficient. Their occult museum grew steadily. Each object had a story and associated case. In addition to Annabelle, There were mirrors supposedly used in necromancy rituals, satanic idols confiscated from crime scenes, photographs that supposedly captured entities, possessed toys, clothing from possession victims. The Warrens offered limited museum tours, always with strict warnings about not touching anything and maintaining respectful attitudes. According to them, the objects retained dangerous energies that could follow disrespectful visitors to their homes. The Warrens' methodology remained consistent over decades. When contacted about a potential case, they first conducted exhaustive telephone interviews to determine if it was worth investigating. They rejected cases that sounded clearly fraudulent or where natural explanations were obvious. If they decided to investigate, Ed reviewed all available historical records of the property or people involved. Lorraine performed her psychic evaluations. They looked for patterns. Did the phenomena follow a schedule? Were they linked to specific objects? Were certain people more affected than others? They documented everything: photographs, audio recordings, written witness testimonies. Fame brings scrutiny, and for Ed and Lorraine Warren, the more their reputation as paranormal investigators grew, the more intense became the criticisms from skeptics, scientists, and other paranormal investigators who questioned their methods, their motivations, and the authenticity of their cases. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the Warrens found themselves constantly defending their work against accusations ranging from incompetence to deliberate fraud. These battles were fought not only in media and public conferences, but also in courts of justice, where lawsuits and countersuits attempted to determine where legitimate investigation ended and exploitation began. One of the most persistent criticisms against the Warrens came from the scientific and organized skeptical community. Organizations like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, founded in 1976, considered the Warrens as promoters of dangerous superstition who exploited the fear and ignorance of vulnerable people. Dr. Paul Kurtz, founder of the committee according to archived records in the organization, publicly argued at documented conferences that none of the Warren cases had been subjected to rigorous scientific protocols. The evidence they presented, blurry photographs, ambiguous audio recordings, testimonies from emotionally compromised witnesses, did not meet basic standards of verifiability. Joe Nickell, investigator for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and author of multiple books on paranormal phenomena published and archived in public libraries, personally investigated several Warren cases. His analysis of the Amityville case, exhaustively documented in archived academic articles, concluded that the Warrens had either been conscious accomplices in an elaborate fraud or had been victims of their own credulity. Nickell pointed out that the Warrens never allowed qualified skeptics to participate in their initial investigations. By the time other investigators arrived to examine a case, the Warrens had already established the narrative, contaminated the scene, and compromised witnesses with their supernatural interpretations. Even within the paranormal community, the Warrens faced significant criticism. Some investigators accused them of sensationalism, of turning every case into a demon story when more mundane explanations like non-demonic poltergeist activity or even psychological trauma might be sufficient. Dr. Stephen Kaplan, who founded the Parapsychology Institute of Long Island and whose archives are deposited in public universities, was particularly vocal. Kaplan investigated more than 3,000 supposedly paranormal cases during his career, according to archived documentation, and concluded that approximately 95% had natural explanations. He accused the Warrens of applying the opposite filter, seeing demons in almost every case they touched. The most public battle between Kaplan and the Warrens centered on Amityville. Kaplan extensively interviewed George Lutz and concluded that he was deliberately lying. He published his investigation arguing that the entire story had been fabricated for financial motives. The Warrens responded by attacking Kaplan's credibility, suggesting that his skepticism was so extreme that he could not recognize genuine phenomena even when presented before him. This dispute developed over years on television programs, radio interviews, and public conferences, with both sides presenting their cases to audiences that had largely already decided which side they were on. The controversies were not purely academic. They had real consequences for families involved in Warren cases. The Glatzel family bitterly divided over the case of David's possession and the subsequent murder committed by Arne Johnson. Carl Glatzel Jr., David's brother, publicly maintained in documented and archived interviews that his younger brother had never been possessed, that he simply suffered from psychological problems that the Warrens and the exorcists had dramatically exacerbated with their terrifying rituals. Carl argued that the Warrens had seen a publicity opportunity in a mentally vulnerable child and had exploited him without consideration for his long-term well-being. Carl Glatzel sued the Warrens, author Gerald Brittle and publisher Bantam Books in 1987, according to judicial records archived in the Connecticut Superior Court. The lawsuit alleged defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional emotional harm. Carl argued that the book, The Devil in Connecticut, had destroyed his family's reputation, caused psychological distress to David, and profited from their suffering. The lawsuit sought millions of dollars in damages. However, the case faced legal complications. Other members of the Glatzel family, including David's parents and his sister Debbie, publicly maintained that the possession had been real and that the Warrens had tried to help. This family division made it difficult to establish clear damages. The legal case dragged on for years with multiple appeals and proceedings, according to publicly accessible judicial records. Finally, in 1993, the case was dismissed on technical issues related to statutes of limitations. Carl Glatzel never received compensation, but he had achieved his secondary objective, sowing significant public doubts about the Warrens' integrity. Media outlets that covered the case, with articles archived in newspapers like the Hartford Courant and the New York Times, presented both sides, but the simple fact that members of the affected family itself questioned the Warren version was damaging to their credibility. The Warrens also faced criticism from the religious community that supposedly backed them. Although they maintained relationships with several individual Catholic priests, the official position of the Catholic Church on their work was ambiguous at best. The Vatican never officially recognized the Warrens as legitimate consultants, according to Holy See records accessible to researchers. Some diocesan bishops in Connecticut and other regions actively warned priests against working with the Warrens, arguing that their sensationalist approach and pursuit of publicity were incompatible with the seriousness with which the Church treated cases of supposed demonic possession. Father Jeffrey Grob, official exorcist of the Archdiocese of Chicago and whose statements are documented in archived interviews, expressed reservations about paranormal investigators like the Warrens. While acknowledging that some genuine cases of possession existed, he argued that the vast majority of people seeking exorcisms suffered from mental illnesses that required psychiatric treatment, not religious rituals. Grob suggested that investigators like the Warrens, by validating supernatural interpretations prematurely, could be causing harm by diverting people from the medical help they truly needed. This criticism touched a particularly sensitive point. The Warrens insisted they always recommended that families first seek medical and psychological evaluations before considering supernatural explanations. But critics pointed to cases where this sequence seemed to have been inverted. The David Glatzel case was an example. The Warrens became involved and began talking about demonic possession before the child received a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. This established an interpretive framework that made it difficult for the family to consider non-supernatural alternatives once the process had begun. Another source of controversy was the financial question. The Warrens publicly maintained in documented interviews that they never charged for their paranormal investigations. This claim was technically true. They did not present invoices to the families they investigated. But critics pointed out that the Warrens earned substantial money indirectly from their cases. They wrote books about their investigations, received royalties. They gave paid lectures where they shared stories of their most dramatic cases. They consulted on film projects based on their cases. Their occult museum charged admission. They sold photographs and other materials related to their investigations. Joe Nickell calculated in documented and archived analyses that the Warrens had potentially earned millions of dollars over their career from cases they claimed to investigate for free. This created an obvious conflict of interest. The more dramatic and supernatural a case was, the more valuable the story became for books, lectures, and films. Skeptics argued that this business model incentivized the Warrens to interpret ambiguous cases in the most sensational way possible, to see demons where there might be more mundane but less lucrative explanations. The Warrens responded to these accusations by arguing they deserved to be compensated for decades of hard and frequently dangerous work. Ed pointed out in documented interviews that they had dedicated their entire lives to this work, constantly traveling at their own initial cost, risking their reputation and, according to their perspective, their souls. If they could subsequently write books about their experiences, that was legitimate. They were not charging vulnerable families in their moments of desperation, which would be morally reprehensible. They were sharing their stories with a wider audience and being compensated for that secondary work. The arrival of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s intensified these controversies. Skeptics could now organize online, share research, coordinate criticisms. Every Warren claim was dissected in forums and websites dedicated to critical thinking. Documents that contradicted Warren narratives circulated widely. Photographs that the Warrens presented as evidence of paranormal phenomena were analyzed by photography experts who identified natural explanations: lens reflections, accidental double exposures, or in some cases, according to these analyses archived in skepticism blogs, deliberate manipulation. Simultaneously, the Warrens gained new defenders online. Believers in the paranormal created their own websites, forums, and eventually YouTube channels dedicated to defending the Warren legacy and promoting their cases as genuine. These defenders argued that excessive skepticism was as dogmatic as excessive credulity, that rejecting all anomalous evidence on principle was not scientific but scientistic. They pointed out that currently accepted phenomena, from electricity to quantum mechanics, were initially rejected by scientific establishments. Perhaps, they argued, the Warrens were simply ahead of their time, investigating phenomena that science would eventually validate. As Ed aged, his health began to decline. In 1996, he suffered a severe stroke according to medical records referenced in authorized biographies. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and significantly limited his mobility and communication ability. Lorraine assumed a more prominent role as public spokesperson for their joint work. She continued giving lectures, conducting selective investigations, maintaining the museum. But the dynamic had changed. Ed had been the analytical figure, the investigator who reviewed historical records and coordinated technical aspects. Without his full participation, Lorraine's work became more dependent on her psychic perceptions, which gave critics more ammunition to question the investigation's objectivity. In the 2000s, Hollywood rediscovered the Warren cases. Director James Wan, fascinated by the Peron family case, decided to turn it into a film. The Conjuring, released in 2013, was a massive box office success, generating almost $318 million worldwide according to Box Office Mojo records. The film presented dramatized versions of Ed and Lorraine Warren as valiant heroes fighting against demonic forces to save innocent families. Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, the actors who portrayed the Warrens, captured their dynamic, Ed as the pragmatic and protective investigator, Lorraine as the sensitive psychic medium. The success of The Conjuring launched a complete cinematic universe. Sequels, prequels, spin-offs based on Warren cases were produced. Annabelle received multiple films of its own. The Nun explored a demonic entity that the Warrens had supposedly encountered. Each film generated hundreds of millions of dollars. This success renewed public interest in the Warrens, but also intensified scrutiny. Film critics and investigative journalists researched the real cases behind the films and frequently discovered that the cinematic versions had exaggerated, dramatized, or completely invented elements. Andrea Peron, whose memoirs had inspired The Conjuring, expressed mixed feelings about the film in documented interviews. She appreciated that her story reached a wide audience but felt the film had oversimplified and overdramatized complex events. More problematically, the film had presented Ed and Lorraine Warren in a much more heroic manner than Andrea remembered. In her experience documented in her book, the Warrens had visited briefly, conducted their investigation, but had not provided the miraculous solution the film suggested. The phenomena at the Peron farm continued for years after the Warrens' involvement. Ed Warren's final years were a mixture of reflection, physical limitations, and a legacy under construction. After the 1996 stroke that left him partially paralyzed, Ed was forced to drastically reduce his active participation in field investigations. But his mind remained sharp, and from his home in Monroe, Connecticut, he continued consulting on cases, reviewing evidence sent by other investigators, and sharing decades of accumulated knowledge with a new generation of paranormal investigators who considered him a legendary figure. He spent afternoons in his study, surrounded by case files, photographs from a lifetime dedicated to pursuing the inexplicable, objects that told horror stories most people would never experience. Lorraine became his eyes, ears, and legs. At 70 years of age, when many people would consider retirement, Lorraine Warren maintained a schedule that would exhaust investigators decades younger. She traveled to cases she considered genuinely urgent, gave lectures at universities and paranormal centers, maintained correspondence with hundreds of people seeking advice about potentially supernatural situations. But her priority was always Ed. Every night, according to interviews documented with her daughter Judy Spera and publicly archived, Lorraine would sit with Ed and tell him the details of her day. He listened, offered perspectives based on his vast experience, and together they evaluated cases even when his body no longer allowed him to investigate them personally. On August 23, 2006, Edward Warren Miney died at his home in Monroe, Connecticut at 79 years of age. According to his death certificate publicly archived in Connecticut state records, the cause was complications related to his deteriorated health condition following the stroke. He had lived 10 years beyond what many doctors had predicted after the severe stroke, a resistance that Lorraine attributed to his fighting spirit and unwavering faith. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's Church in Monroe, the same church where Ed and Lorraine had worshipped for decades. Hundreds of people attended, according to archived local newspaper reports. Family, friends, paranormal investigators from around the world, priests who had worked with him, and families he had helped throughout his extraordinary career. Ed's death left an enormous void not only in Lorraine's life but in the broader paranormal community. Tributes came from unexpected places. Even some skeptics who had debated with Ed for decades acknowledged in documented public statements that he had been an intelligent, passionate opponent genuinely dedicated to what he believed. Joe Nickell, who had harshly criticized the Warrens' work for years, wrote in an archived article that although he had never agreed with Ed's conclusions, he respected his commitment and the sincerity with which he approached each case. For Ed Warren, Nickell argued, this had never been simply a business or pursuit of fame. It was a vocation in which he genuinely believed. Lorraine, now 79 years old and widowed after 61 years of marriage, faced the question many asked her: would she continue the work? Her answer was unequivocal. In documented interviews in the months following Ed's death, Lorraine declared she would continue as long as her health permitted. Ed would not have wanted her to stop. There were too many people who needed help, too many legitimate cases requiring investigation. But she acknowledged the work would be different without Ed. He had provided the analytical balance to her intuitive perceptions. Together they had been a formidable team. Alone she would have to be more selective, more careful. During the years following Ed's death, Lorraine continued giving lectures and interviews, now with a more reflective and nostalgic tone. She spoke not only of cases but of her life with Ed, of how they had met as teenagers, of 61 years of partnership that had been simultaneously a traditional marriage and a unique professional collaboration. She shared anecdotes that humanized Ed. His love for painting, his sense of humor during tense moments in investigations, his tenderness as a father and grandfather. These stories presented a fuller and more nuanced image than the heroic figure of the films or the caricature some critics had created. The Warren Occult Museum, still operating in the basement of their home in Monroe, became a sanctuary not only to paranormal cases but to Ed's memory. Lorraine added photographs of their life together, awards and recognitions they had received, thank you letters from families they had helped. Annabelle remained in her glass case, still the main attraction according to visitors whose testimonies are documented in paranormal forums and blogs. But now she shared space with more personal memorials to a couple who had dedicated their lives to the extraordinary. Tony Spera, the Warrens' son-in-law married to their daughter Judy, gradually assumed more responsibilities in maintaining the Warren legacy. Tony had worked with Ed and Lorraine for decades, according to his biography documented on the official Warren website publicly archived. He had participated in investigations, learned their methods, absorbed their philosophy. With Lorraine's blessing, Tony began giving his own lectures, consulting on cases, serving as custodian of the vast archive of documents, photographs and recordings the Warrens had accumulated. Judy, who had grown up surrounded by the paranormal but had mostly maintained a private life, also became more involved in preserving her parents' history. In 2013, the premiere of The Conjuring brought a new generation of interest in the Warrens. Lorraine, now 86 years old, attended the film's premiere alongside Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, the actors who portrayed her and Ed. Photographs from the event, archived on entertainment sites and media, show Lorraine moved and emotional seeing her life with Ed represented on the big screen. Although the film took dramatic liberties, Lorraine expressed in documented interviews her appreciation for how it captured the essence of their relationship and their work. She particularly praised the film's decision to show their romantic relationship as central to their work, not simply as background. The massive success of The Conjuring and its sequels elevated the Warrens to a level of cultural recognition they had never experienced during decades of actual work. People who had never heard of them before now knew their names. The Occult Museum experienced a dramatic increase in visit requests, so many that Tony Spera had to implement a reservation system according to statements documented in interviews. Universities that had previously been skeptical about giving platform to paranormal investigators now invited Lorraine and Tony to speak, recognizing student interest generated by the films. But the renewed interest also brought renewed scrutiny. Investigative journalists, driven by the film's popularity, revisited Warren cases with a critical eye. Articles and publications like The Hollywood Reporter and Variety, publicly archived online, investigated discrepancies between real events and their cinematic representations. They interviewed members of families involved in Warren cases who expressed more complicated perspectives than those presented in films. David Glatzel's brother renewed his public criticisms in documented interviews, arguing that the films perpetuated a false narrative that had harmed his family. Lorraine, in her final years, responded to these criticisms with a mixture of patience and firmness developed during decades of controversy. In documented interviews between 2013 and 2018, her message was consistent. She and Ed had done the best they could with the knowledge and tools they had. They had never claimed to be infallible. They had made mistakes, learned from them, refined their methods. But they remained convinced that the vast majority of their cases had involved genuinely supernatural phenomena. People could believe or not believe, but she knew what she had experienced, what she had seen with her own eyes and felt with her own psychic abilities. On April 18, 2019, Lorraine Rita Warren died peacefully at her home in Monroe, Connecticut at 92 years of age. According to her death certificate archived in Connecticut state records, the cause was heart failure related to age. She had lived 13 years longer than Ed, years she had dedicated to preserving their joint legacy and continuing the work they had begun together as teenagers in love over 70 years earlier. Her funeral, like Ed's, attracted hundreds of attendees according to archived local media reports. Vera Farmiga attended, paying respect to the woman she had portrayed on screen. Patrick Wilson sent public condolences documented on social media, expressing his honor of having represented Ed Warren. The legacy of Ed and Lorraine Warren remains deeply controversial. For believers in the paranormal, they represent brave pioneers who dedicated their lives to helping people terrorized by phenomena that mainstream science refused to recognize. They explored dark territories where others feared to venture. They documented cases that, regardless of interpretation, involved real people experiencing real distress. They provided comfort and hope to families who felt completely powerless in the face of the inexplicable. Their archives, now maintained by Tony Spera and selectively available to serious researchers according to policies documented on the official Warren website, contain decades of testimonies, photographs and recordings that constitute a unique historical archive of 20th-century American paranormal culture. For skeptics, the Warrens represent everything problematic about non-critical thinking applied to serious situations. They argue that the Warrens, well-intentioned or not, diverted people from legitimate medical and psychological treatments toward supernatural interpretations that could not help and potentially caused harm. That their business model, although technically not charging for investigations, created perverse incentives to interpret cases in the most dramatic and lucrative way possible. That their legacy, magnified by Hollywood, perpetuates superstitious beliefs that society should overcome. That in the age of reason and science, dedicating resources and attention to ghost hunters is fundamentally regressive. The truth, as frequently occurs, probably exists somewhere between these extremes. Ed and Lorraine Warren were complex human beings who operated at the intersection of belief, entertainment, religion, and the genuinely inexplicable. They lived during an era of massive cultural change, from post-war America to the digital age. They were simultaneously products of their time, deeply Catholic in an increasingly secular era, and surprisingly modern in how they used media to amplify their message. Their 61-year marriage was, by all documented accounts even from critics, genuinely loving and a true collaboration where each one's strengths complemented the other's weaknesses. Today the debate continues. Each new film from the Conjuring universe reignites discussions about the real cases. Podcasts dedicated to the paranormal analyze Warren investigations with believing perspectives. Skeptical podcasts dissect them, searching for errors and exaggerations. Academics in emerging fields like cultural studies of the paranormal examine the Warrens not necessarily to determine if ghosts exist but to understand what the Warrens tell us about American beliefs, cultural fears, and the persistence of the supernatural in a supposedly scientific era. The Occult Museum remains open under Tony Spera's administration, a physical reminder of lives dedicated to the extraordinary. And somewhere, if the Warrens were right about the afterlife, perhaps Ed and Lorraine continue their work on a different plane, finally with definitive answers to the questions that drove them during their earthly lives.